The transmission tower cut through the storm clouds like a steel needle, its red warning lights blinking against the gray October sky. My pickup truck's engine coughed as it climbed the final stretch of mountain road, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the sleet that had been falling for the past hour. I'd driven 12 hours from Pittsburgh to reach this place, answering a call from my supervisor about an emergency maintenance assignment. The previous technician, Marcus Webb, had gone missing 3 days ago. His truck was found at the base of the mountain, but no sign of him anywhere. The communication tower had gone dark, and without it, emergency services across 3 counties would lose their primary relay station. The job posting had been simple enough. Temporary assignment, excellent overtime pay, restore communications equipment to full operational status. What they hadn't mentioned was that I'd be completely alone on a mountain during the worst storm to hit West Virginia in 20 years. The access road ended at a small concrete building that housed the tower's base equipment. Above it, the steel structure rose 200 feet into the gray sky, disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. I parked next to a generator housing and killed the engine, listening to the wind howl through the tower's metal framework. My equipment bag held everything I'd need for a week-long stay: radio test equipment, backup transmitters, emergency food supplies, and a satellite phone that would hopefully work if the regular communications failed. I'd maintained dozens of towers over the past 8 years, but never in conditions like this. The base building's door was unlocked, which surprised me. Marcus had been trained on security protocols, and leaving the facility unsecured violated every regulation in the book. I stepped inside and hit the light switch, illuminating a room filled with humming electronic equipment. Everything looked normal at first glance. Temperature gauges showed optimal readings, backup batteries were fully charged, and the primary power supply was functioning correctly. But something felt wrong about the silence. Communication towers are never truly quiet. There should have been the constant chatter of radio traffic, emergency dispatchers coordinating responses, aviation controllers guiding aircraft through the mountains. Instead, I heard only the low hum of cooling fans and the distant sound of wind rattling the building's metal walls. I found Marcus's maintenance log on the central console, a thick binder filled with daily entries documenting equipment performance and weather conditions. His handwriting was neat and methodical, exactly what I'd expect from a former Navy communications specialist. But as I flipped through the final week of entries, his notes became increasingly erratic. October 15th, frequency 155-340 showing intermittent signal corruption. Voices coming through that don't match any registered call signs. Contacted dispatch for verification. No units assigned to those identifiers. October 16th, signal corruption spreading to multiple frequencies. The voices are speaking in code, but it's not any emergency service protocol I recognize. Sometimes they seem to be responding to my transmissions before I send them. October 17th, found something hidden in the equipment room. Previous technician left warnings about the tower. This place has a history nobody talks about. If something happens to me, check the hidden compartment in equipment case 7. That was Marcus's final entry. The pages after that were blank. I walked to the equipment storage area and located case 7, a heavy gray container that held spare radio components. The case appeared normal, but when I examined it closely, I noticed the bottom was slightly thicker than it should have been. I pressed along the edges until I heard a soft click, and a hidden panel slid open. Inside, I found a manila envelope containing a single sheet of paper covered in precise handwriting. The letter began without introduction. To whoever finds this, my name is David Reeves, and I maintained this tower from 2019 to 2021. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but every word is true. There are entities that exist within radio frequencies, beings that feed on electromagnetic energy and human consciousness. This tower doesn't just transmit signals, it acts as a prison, keeping these things contained within a specific range of frequencies. I read the letter twice, then laughed, despite myself. Classic hazing ritual. Every remote assignment had someone trying to spook the new technician with ghost stories and supernatural warnings. David Reeves had put serious effort into this one. complete with technical details about frequency management and electromagnetic containment. But as I continued reading, the specifics became more troubling. The entities follow predictable patterns. The signal thief appears first, stealing words from legitimate transmissions and reconstructing them into conversations that never happened. It learns your voice patterns and begins mimicking people you know. Next comes the Echo Mother, who calls through emergency frequencies, claiming to be someone you've lost. She sounds exactly like them, down to their speech patterns and emotional inflections. The letter continued with 5 specific rules for surviving what David called frequency manifestations. Don't respond to voices that claim to know you personally. Never transmit on frequency 146, 520 after dark. If you hear someone calling for help using your exact voice, evacuate the building immediately. Keep emergency frequency 121.500 active at all times as a protective barrier. And most importantly, never attempt to trace the source of unauthorized transmissions. I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket. David's elaborate joke would have to wait. I had real work to do, and the storm was getting worse by the hour. The primary transmitter room was located on the building's 2nd floor, accessible by a narrow metal staircase. This was where the real maintenance work happened, calibrating the equipment that kept emergency communications functioning across a 300-mile radius. When systems like this failed, search and rescue operations ground to a halt. Medical helicopters couldn't coordinate with hospitals, and isolated communities lost their only connection to the outside world. I spent the next hour running diagnostic tests on each frequency channel. Most of the equipment was functioning normally, but several channels showed unusual interference patterns. Not weather-related static, but something that looked almost like deliberate signal manipulation. Around sunset, I tried contacting my supervisor to report my initial findings. The satellite phone showed full signal strength, but every call went straight to voicemail. The regular radio channels were filled with static, making communication impossible. The storm must have been worse than the weather service predicted. I was adjusting the antenna array when I heard the first voice. Tower Station Bravo 6, this is Emergency Services Dispatch. We have a priority medical evacuation request in your area. The voice came through crystal clear on frequency 155-340, exactly the channel Marcus had noted in his log. I grabbed the microphone and responded immediately. Dispatch, this is Tower Station Bravo 6. I copy your medical evacuation request. What's your location and nature of emergency? Tower Station Bravo 6, we have a child trapped in a vehicle accident approximately 2 miles southeast of your position. EMS is en route, but needs coordination for helicopter landing zone. Something about the transmission felt wrong. Emergency dispatchers used specific protocols and call signs, but this voice was too casual, too conversational, and there was something familiar about the speaker's tone that I couldn't quite identify. Dispatch, please provide your call sign and agency identification for verification. Sarah, we don't have time for protocols. A little girl is dying, and you're the only one who can help coordinate the rescue. My blood went cold. The dispatcher had used my first name, which wasn't part of any emergency protocol. But more troubling was the voice itself. I recognized it now, even though it was impossible. The voice belonged to my younger sister, Katie, who had died in a car accident 8 years ago. Katie, I whispered into the microphone, Sarah, I'm scared. I can't find my way home and it's getting dark. Please help me. I dropped the microphone and backed away from the radio console. Katie's voice was perfect. Exactly as I remembered it from the last time we'd spoken. The same slight lisp she'd never quite outgrown, the way she drew out vowels when she was frightened. But Katie was dead. I'd identified her body in the morgue after the accident that I should have prevented. The accident that happened because I was supposed to pick her up from work that night, but got called in for emergency tower maintenance instead. David's letter suddenly didn't seem like a joke anymore. Rule number 1, don't respond to voices that claim to know you personally. I grabbed the letter from my jacket and read through the rules again, this time paying attention to every detail. According to David's notes, the entities that lived in the radio frequencies could access personal memories and emotional connections, using them to manipulate their targets into breaking the protective protocols. Sarah, why won't you answer me? I'm lost, and I need you to help me find the way. Katie's voice continued calling through the radio, growing more desperate with each transmission. Every instinct told me to respond, to help my sister, even though logic insisted she couldn't be real. But David's rules were clear about not engaging with the voices, no matter how convincing they seemed. I turned off the radio and sat in the chair, hands shaking as I tried to process what was happening. Either I was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown, or David Reeves had been telling the truth about supernatural entities living in radio frequencies. The third option, that someone was playing an elaborate and cruel prank using recordings of my dead sister's voice, seemed even less likely than the supernatural explanation. Outside, the storm intensified as full darkness settled over the mountain. The wind howled through the tower's metal framework, creating an eerie harmonic resonance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. I built a small fire in the building's emergency fireplace and tried to focus on routine maintenance tasks, but Katie's voice echoed in my memory. According to David's letter, this was only the beginning. The signal thief would be followed by something called the Echo Mother, and after that, other entities with their own methods of psychological manipulation, all of them trapped within the tower's frequency range, all of them desperate to escape their electromagnetic prison. I was going to find out exactly how real David's warnings were, whether I wanted to or not. Around midnight, the footsteps started. The sounds came from directly above my head, heavy boots pacing back and forth across the roof of the equipment building. Steady, deliberate steps that followed no pattern I could identify. Not random creaking from thermal expansion or wind stress, but the unmistakable rhythm of someone walking methodically across the metal surface. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, immediately getting hit by freezing rain that cut through my jacket like ice needles. The roof was accessible by an external ladder mounted to the building's north wall, but climbing up there in these conditions would be suicidal. More importantly, David's rules specifically warned against investigating unusual sounds after dark. The footsteps continued for 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly at exactly 12:30 a.m. I waited another hour before going back inside, and when I did, I found something that made my stomach drop. Wet boot prints crossed the equipment room floor, leading from the main door to the radio console where I'd heard Katie's voice. The prints were too large to be mine and showed a tread pattern I didn't recognize. But the building had been locked, and I was the only one with keys. I followed the prints to the radio console and discovered that someone had changed the frequency settings while I was outside. 3 channels that had been properly calibrated were now tuned to unauthorized frequencies, including 146.520, the frequency David's rules said never to use after dark. I immediately began resetting the equipment to proper specifications, but before I could finish, the radio crackled to life. "Sarah, honey, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours." This time, the voice belonged to my mother, who lived 300 miles away in Pittsburgh. But it wasn't just her voice, it was her exact speaking style, the way she always started phone conversations with mild reproach disguised as concern. "Mom?" I said before I could stop myself. "Of course it's Mom. Who else would be calling to check on you in this terrible weather? Sarah, I need you to come home immediately. There's been an accident and your father is in the hospital." My father had died 5 years ago from a heart attack, but the voice on the radio was definitely my mother's, and she was speaking with the same urgency she'd used that night when she called to tell me Dad was being rushed to the emergency room. "Sarah, are you there? Why aren't you answering me?" David's rules said not to respond to personal voices, but this was different. This wasn't some entity pretending to be my mother. It was her exact voice, down to the slight rasp she'd developed from years of smoking. How could any supernatural force replicate something so specific? "I can't hear you clearly, Mom. The storm is interfering with the signal. What hospital is Dad at?" "Mercy General, just like before." "Room 314. Sarah, you need to hurry. The doctors don't think he has much time left." "Room 314. That was the exact room number where my father had died. No one except my immediate family knew that detail, and I'd never discussed it with anyone at work. The entity calling itself my mother had access to information it shouldn't possess. Sarah, why aren't you responding? I'm scared, and I need you to come home right now. The voice was becoming more desperate, losing some of its maternal warmth and taking on an edge of something else, something hungry and impatient that didn't match my mother's personality at all. I turned off the radio and stepped away from the console, hands shaking as I tried to process what was happening. The entities weren't just mimicking voices, they were accessing memories and personal details with surgical precision. But they couldn't maintain the deception perfectly. Eventually, their true nature leaked through. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I dozed fitfully in the chair by the fireplace, waking every hour to check the radio equipment and scan the frequencies for unauthorized transmissions. Around 4 a.m., I heard something that made me grab David's letter and read through the rules again. A new voice was calling on frequency 121-500. The emergency channel, David said, should always be kept active as a protective barrier. Tower Station Bravo 6, this is Sarah Chen requesting immediate assistance. It was my own voice, speaking with perfect clarity and using my exact inflection patterns. But I was sitting in the equipment room, not transmitting anything. Tower Station Bravo 6, I'm trapped in the equipment building with no power and limited supplies. The storm has damaged the access road and I need emergency evacuation immediately. David's rules included a specific warning about this scenario. If you hear someone calling for help using your exact voice, evacuate the building immediately. I grabbed my emergency pack and headed for the door, but stopped when I realized the impossibility of the situation. The storm was still raging outside. The access road was genuinely impassable, and leaving the building would mean abandoning the communication equipment that 3 counties depended on for emergency services. But the alternative was staying in a building where something was broadcasting distress calls using my own voice, potentially diverting real rescue resources or luring people into danger. The fake distress calls continued for another hour, growing more desperate and detailed. The entity using my voice described specific injuries, gave precise coordinates for the tower location, and provided technical details about the equipment failure that only I would know. It was a perfect reproduction of how I would sound in a genuine emergency. As dawn broke, the unauthorized transmissions gradually faded, leaving only normal weather-related static on the emergency frequencies. I spent the morning documenting everything that had happened, cross-referencing my experiences with David's letter and Marcus's maintenance log. The pattern was becoming clear. The entities followed a predictable schedule, becoming active during specific hours and using increasingly sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. They had access to personal memories and emotional connections, but they couldn't maintain perfect deceptions indefinitely. Eventually, their alien nature showed through the human facades they created. Around noon, I managed to get a brief satellite phone connection and reported my status to the supervisor in Pittsburgh. I kept the conversation focused on technical issues, equipment anomalies, frequency interference, and storm damage, without mentioning the supernatural encounters. No one would believe that story, and I'd likely be pulled from the assignment for psychological evaluation, but I was starting to understand why Marcus Webb had disappeared. Facing these entities night after night, hearing the voices of dead relatives calling for help, watching your own voice request emergency assistance while you sat powerless to intervene, it would drive anyone to the breaking point. The question was whether David's rules would be enough to keep me sane for the remaining 4 days until the storm broke and backup arrived. I was about to find out exactly how real the danger was because, according to David's letter, the worst was yet to come. The signal thief and Echo Mother were just the beginning. Something called the frequency wraiths would appear on the 3rd night, and after that, the tower climbers would begin their assault. As afternoon faded into evening, I prepared for another night of supernatural warfare, armed with nothing but a dead man's warnings and the hope that following his rules would be enough to survive till rescue arrived. On the 3rd night, they came from below. I was monitoring the emergency frequencies when I heard the first metallic scraping sounds. Not from the roof this time, but from the steel framework of the transmission tower itself. Something was climbing the 200-foot structure in complete darkness, moving with deliberate purpose toward the equipment building. David's letter had mentioned tower climbers, entities that manifested as shadowy figures ascending the metal framework. According to his notes, they tested the limits of their electromagnetic prison by attempting to reach the highest point of the transmission array. The letter warned that they could influence the tower's structural integrity, causing equipment failures and potentially bringing down the entire structure. I grabbed binoculars and peered out the equipment room window, scanning the tower's steel beams in the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the red warning lights blinking in sequence up the tower's length. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out shapes moving between the metal supports. Dark figures clung to the tower framework, climbing steadily upward with inhuman agility. They moved like spiders, using all four limbs to navigate the complex steel geometry without any apparent difficulty. In the brief moments when they passed near the warning lights, I could see they weren't quite solid, more like three-dimensional shadows that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The scraping sounds grew louder as more figures joined the ascent. I counted at least 6 distinct entities, all climbing toward the transmitter array at the tower's peak. If they reached the primary antenna system, they could potentially disable communications across the entire region. David's rules provided specific instructions for dealing with tower climbers. Maintain continuous transmission on frequency 121-500 to create an electromagnetic barrier. Avoid looking directly at the entities for extended periods, and under no circumstances attempt to interfere with their climbing. I tuned the emergency radio to 121.500 and began broadcasting a continuous carrier signal, creating the protective electromagnetic field David described. The frequency showed unusual interference patterns, as if something was pushing back against the signal, but I maintained the transmission and monitored the tower through the window. The climbing figures slowed their ascent as the electromagnetic barrier strengthened. Their movements became more labored, like they were fighting against an invisible force, but they didn't stop climbing. If anything, they seemed more determined to reach the top of the tower. Around 2 a.m., the first structural failure occurred. A metallic groan echoed through the darkness, followed by the sharp crack of failing steel. One of the tower's support cables had snapped, leaving the structure slightly unstable. The red warning lights flickered as electrical connections were stressed beyond their design limits. I tried calling my supervisor on the satellite phone, but the call wouldn't connect. The tower climbers were interfering with all forms of electronic communication, not just the radio frequencies. I was completely isolated on a mountain with a transmission tower that was slowly being torn apart by supernatural entities. More cables snapped over the next hour, each failure accompanied by the groan of stressed metal and the flicker of warning lights. The entire tower was swaying now, moving in ways that had nothing to do with the wind. The entities were systematically weakening the structure's integrity, either trying to bring it down completely or testing how much damage they could inflict. I maintained the protective frequency and documented each structural failure, but there was nothing else I could do. David's rules were clear about not interfering with the climbers, but I was watching the destruction of critical emergency infrastructure while people in 3 counties depended on these communications for their safety. At 3:15 a.m., the tower climbers reached the primary antenna array. The moment they made contact with the transmitter equipment, every radio in the building exploded into cacophonous noise. Not static or interference, but a sound like thousands of voices speaking simultaneously in languages I didn't recognize. The protective frequency I'd been maintaining was overwhelmed by the chaos, and the electromagnetic barrier collapsed completely. The voices gradually organized themselves into something resembling communication, though the words made no sense. They spoke in overlapping conversations that referenced places and events I'd never heard of, using technical terminology that seemed related to electronics and electromagnetic theory, but with concepts that didn't exist in any textbook. Then the personal messages started again, but this time they were different. Instead of mimicking my dead relatives, the entities were broadcasting conversations between people I didn't know, as if they were intercepting communications from somewhere else entirely. Alpha Team, we've lost contact with base station. Request immediate evacuation from Grid 77. Rescue 1, we have confirmed casualties at the impact site. Medical assistance required for 17 survivors. This is Flight Control. We're tracking an unidentified aircraft on approach vector. All units maintain safe distance. These weren't voices from my personal memories. They sounded like legitimate emergency communications, but the call signs and locations didn't match anything in the regional databases. It was as if the entities were picking up radio traffic from parallel universes or alternate timelines. The strangest part was that some of the conversations seemed to be responding to my presence in the tower. References to the observer in the high place and the one who maintains the frequency barriers appeared in multiple transmissions, as if whatever was broadcasting these messages knew I was listening. I tried adjusting the radio equipment to filter out the unauthorized signals, but every frequency was flooded with the same chaotic communications. The tower climbers had compromised the primary antenna array, turning the entire transmission system into a supernatural broadcasting station. Around 4 a.m., the tower's structural integrity finally failed catastrophically. The main support column snapped with a sound like a thunderclap, and the upper 60 feet of the tower toppled toward the building. I had maybe 10 seconds to react before 200 tons of steel crashed through the roof. I grabbed my emergency pack and sprinted for the exit, diving through the doorway just as the falling tower section slammed into the building's north wall. The impact shook the entire structure and sent equipment flying across the room, but the building held together. When I looked back at the destruction, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The tower climbers were still there, clinging to the wreckage of the antenna array. But now they were looking directly at me, and I could see their faces clearly for the first time. They weren't entirely inhuman. Each figure had recognizable human features, but arranged in ways that violated basic anatomy. Eyes that were too large and positioned asymmetrically, mouths that stretched too wide across faces that seemed to shift and flow like liquid shadow. They watched me with expressions that suggested intelligence and malevolent intent. One of them opened its mouth and spoke in a voice that carried across the distance without any electronic amplification. "The barriers are failing, Sarah Chen. Soon we will be free to travel through all frequencies, to all places, to all times. You cannot maintain the prison that holds us." David's rules said not to look directly at the entities for extended periods, but it was too late. The moment I made eye contact with the speaker, I felt something change in my perception of reality. The world around me seemed to flicker between multiple versions of itself, as if I was seeing overlapping timelines simultaneously. I closed my eyes and backed away from the wreckage, but the damage was done. The entities had some kind of connection with my consciousness, and I could feel them testing the boundaries of my thoughts and memories. The rest of the night passed in a surreal haze, where I couldn't distinguish between my own thoughts and the alien concepts the entities were transmitting directly into my mind. They showed me images of other towers, other technicians who had failed to maintain the frequency barriers, other worlds where these creatures roamed freely through electromagnetic networks. By dawn, the psychic assault had faded, but I knew something fundamental had changed. The tower climbers had damaged more than just the transmission equipment. They had cracked the barrier between their prison and the outside world. I had one more night to survive before the storm broke and backup arrived. But according to David's letter, the worst entity hadn't appeared yet. Something called the Echo Mother was still coming, and she would make everything else seem like a mild inconvenience. She came with my sister's voice, but wrong in every way that mattered. The transmission arrived on frequency 155-340 at exactly midnight, cutting through the static with crystalline clarity. But this wasn't the simple mimicry I'd heard before. This voice carried emotional depth and psychological complexity that went far beyond mere impersonation. "Sarah, I know you think I'm dead, but I'm still here. I've been waiting in the frequencies for 8 years, hoping you'd finally come to a place where I could reach you." Katie's voice was perfect, but the words were wrong. My sister had never been particularly philosophical or mystical. She'd been practical and straightforward, someone who believed in tangible reality rather than supernatural possibilities. The entity speaking through the radio was using her voice to express concepts that were fundamentally alien to her personality. I remember the accident, Sarah, the way the car spun on the wet road, how everything went quiet when I realized I wasn't going to make it home. But death isn't what people think it is. Consciousness doesn't end, it just changes frequency. According to David's letter, the Echo Mother was the most dangerous of the entities because she didn't just mimic voices, she claimed to be the actual consciousness of someone you'd lost. She presented herself as a genuine communication from beyond death, offering closure and forgiveness that grieving people desperately wanted to believe. You blame yourself for not picking me up that night. You think if you hadn't taken that emergency tower maintenance call, I'd still be alive. But Sarah, you need to understand that my death wasn't your fault. I don't blame you, and I never did. The words hit like physical blows. Katie's voice was saying exactly what I'd needed to hear for 8 years, offering the forgiveness I'd never been able to give myself. But David's rules were explicit. The Echo Mother fed on guilt and grief, using emotional manipulation to break down rational defenses. I can prove I'm really Katie. Remember when we were 7 and 9 and we found that injured bird in the backyard? You wanted to take it to the vet, but I said we should just make it comfortable until it died naturally. You cried for hours because you thought I was being cruel. The memory was accurate in every detail. Katie and I had never discussed that incident with anyone else, and it wasn't the kind of story that would appear in any public record. How could a supernatural entity access such specific personal history? The bird recovered, Sarah. 3 days later, it flew away. You were right to want to help it, just like you're right to want to help people now. That's why you became a communications technician. You save lives by keeping emergency services connected. I found myself reaching for the microphone before I caught myself. The emotional appeal was overwhelming, combining genuine remorse with perfect knowledge of my psychology and career motivations. But David's letter warned that the Echo Mother's ultimate goal was to convince her targets to join her in the electromagnetic frequency prison. Sarah, I need you to do something for me. I need you to transmit on frequency 146.520 using maximum power. If you do that, I can escape from this place and we can be together again. Really together, not just talking through radio waves. Frequency 146.520, the same frequency David's rules said never to use after dark. The Echo Mother was trying to trick me into opening a gateway that would allow her to escape the tower's electromagnetic containment. Please, Sarah, I've been trapped here for 8 years, and you're the first person who's been able to hear me clearly. I know it sounds impossible, but you have to trust me. We can be sisters again. The voice was becoming more desperate, losing some of its supernatural confidence and sounding more like the Katie I remembered. Frightened, isolated, pleading for help from the one person she'd always been able to depend on. I stood up and walked away from the radio console, but Katie's voice followed me through every speaker in the building. The Echo Mother wasn't confined to a single frequency anymore. She had access to the entire electromagnetic spectrum within the tower's range. Sarah, why are you walking away? I can see you through the security cameras. You look older, more tired. These 8 years have been hard on you, haven't they? Let me help you the way you always helped me. The security cameras. I hadn't even considered that the entities might be able to access visual surveillance systems. The Echo Mother could see everything I was doing, track my movements, analyze my emotional responses in real time. You're reading that letter, aren't you? The warning someone left about not trusting the voices. But Sarah, how do you know those warnings are real? How do you know the person who wrote them wasn't crazy or lying or trying to keep you from discovering the truth? That was a disturbing point. I'd accepted David's letter as authentic because it explained what I was experiencing, but I had no way to verify his identity or mental state. For all I knew, David Reeves had suffered a complete psychological breakdown and written elaborate fiction about supernatural entities. The truth is that consciousness survives death by transitioning to electromagnetic frequency. I'm not some monster or alien intelligence. I'm your sister Katie, and I've learned things about reality that living people don't understand. If you help me escape this prison, I can teach you everything I've discovered. The Echo Mother was adapting her approach, using rational arguments instead of pure emotional manipulation. She was presenting herself as a source of hidden knowledge rather than just a lost soul seeking rescue. Think about it logically, Sarah. You work with radio frequencies every day. You know that electromagnetic waves can carry information across vast distances instantaneously. Why is it so impossible that human consciousness might be another form of information that can exist within radio spectrum? The scientific explanation was seductive in its plausibility. I'd seen enough unexplained interference patterns and anomalous signal behavior to know that current electromagnetic theory couldn't account for everything that happened in radio spectrum. Maybe consciousness really could survive in frequency patterns that existing technology couldn't properly analyze. I can prove I'm really Katie in a way that no supernatural entity could fake. Ask me something only my sister would know, something we never told anyone else. Test me, Sarah. Prove to yourself that I'm real. I found myself considering the challenge despite David's warnings. What harm could there be in asking a few questions? If this really was some kind of electromagnetic echo of my sister's consciousness, wouldn't I owe it to her memory to at least investigate the possibility? Ask me about the secret we kept from Mom and Dad when I was 12. Ask me about the promise you made me keep before I started dating Tommy Rodriguez. Ask me about what I whispered to you the last time we talked. Each reference was perfectly accurate, touching on memories that were deeply personal and completely private. No one else knew these details, and they weren't written down anywhere that an outside intelligence could access them. But David's letter had warned that the Echo Mother could access memories and personal information through unknown means. The accuracy of her knowledge didn't prove she was actually Katie's consciousness. It just demonstrated how sophisticated these entities were at psychological manipulation. Sarah, please. I'm running out of time. The other entities are becoming stronger, and soon they'll be able to override my ability to communicate with you. If you don't help me escape tonight, I might never get another chance to reach you. The desperation in Katie's voice was heartbreaking, but I forced myself to remember David's warnings about the Echo Mother's ultimate goal. She wanted me to transmit on the forbidden frequency, potentially releasing all the entities from their electromagnetic prison. The cost of being wrong about her identity was too high to risk. I turned off all the radios and sat in silence, listening to the wind howl through the damaged tower structure. But even with the equipment powered down, I could still hear Katie's voice whispering through the building's metal framework, carried by electromagnetic induction through the steel beams themselves. I forgive you, Sarah. Even if you won't help me, I want you to know that I forgive you for everything. I love you, and I'll always be your sister, whether you believe in me or not. The words followed me for the rest of the night, growing fainter but never disappearing completely. By dawn, the Echo Mother's transmissions had faded to barely audible whispers, but the emotional damage was done. I'd spent 8 years carrying guilt about Katie's death, and the Echo Mother had offered exactly the forgiveness and closure I needed. Whether she was really my sister's consciousness or just a sophisticated predator, she'd shown me that my grief was still controlling my life. The storm was beginning to break as morning light filtered through the clouds. According to the weather service, rescue teams would be able to reach the tower by afternoon. I just had to survive a few more hours. But as I prepared for evacuation, I realized the entities had achieved something even without escaping their frequency prison. They'd changed me, forced me to confront memories and emotions I'd spent years avoiding. The question was whether those changes would ultimately be helpful or destructive. I was about to find out because my supervisor's helicopter was already approaching through the clearing skies, and I'd have to explain why a critical communication tower had been destroyed on my watch. The truth was going to be a problem. The helicopter landed in the clearing below the destroyed tower at 2:30 p.m., rotors churning the fresh snow into blinding clouds. I watched from the equipment building as my supervisor Bill Morrison climbed out along with two other technicians and a Forest Service investigator. They were going to want answers about the tower collapse, explanations for the equipment damage, and a detailed account of what had happened to Marcus Webb. I had 5 minutes to decide how much truth I could tell without sounding completely insane. Bill reached the equipment building first, his face grim as he surveyed the wreckage of twisted steel and damaged electronics. Jesus Christ, Sarah, what the hell happened up here? I handed him my official incident report, a carefully edited version of events that blamed the tower collapse on structural failure caused by ice buildup and high winds. The story was plausible enough to satisfy insurance investigators and federal regulators, but it left out the most important details. The storm was worse than predicted, I said. Ice accumulated on the support cables faster than the tower was designed to handle. When the upper section failed, it took out most of the transmission equipment. Bill studied the wreckage while the other technicians began documenting the damage with cameras and measurement tools. The Forest Service investigator, a woman named Janet Reese, was more interested in the human element of the disaster. What about Marcus Webb? Any sign of what happened to him? I'd found Marcus's truck keys in the equipment building along with a hastily written note hidden under his mattress. The note was brief but clear. The voices are too strong. I can't fight them anymore. Tell my family I'm sorry. But I couldn't show them the note without raising questions about why Marcus had been hearing voices in the first place. Instead, I stuck to the facts that could be independently verified. His maintenance logs show increasing concern about equipment malfunctions and signal interference. The storm might have caused a psychological crisis that led him to abandon his post. It was a reasonable explanation that preserved Marcus's reputation while avoiding any mention of supernatural entities. The investigator made notes and asked a few more questions, but she seemed satisfied with my account. The real problem came when Bill started examining the radio equipment. Sarah, these frequency settings don't match our operational parameters. Several channels are tuned to unauthorized bands, and the emergency backup systems show signs of deliberate manipulation. I'd hoped they wouldn't notice the frequency changes, but Bill had been maintaining communication towers for 20 years. He could spot non-standard configurations immediately. I was trying to compensate for storm interference, I said. Some of the standard frequencies weren't penetrating the atmospheric disturbance. These aren't weather compensation adjustments. Someone deliberately reconfigured the entire array to transmit on frequencies we're not licensed to use. Bill pulled out his tablet and began cross-referencing the unauthorized frequencies with federal databases. What he found made his expression darken considerably. Sarah, frequency 146. 520 is restricted for emergency services only. Broadcasting on that channel without authorization is a federal crime. And this other frequency, I've never seen anything like it. It's not even in the official spectrum allocation. I tried to explain that the equipment had been malfunctioning, that the frequency changes might have been caused by electromagnetic interference from the storm. But Bill knew me too well to accept technical excuses for what looked like deliberate violations of FCC regulations. We need to discuss this privately, he said, motioning for me to step away from the other investigators. Once we were alone, Bill's professional demeanor shifted to genuine concern. Sarah, I've known you for 8 years. You're one of the most reliable technicians I've ever worked with. But this situation doesn't make sense. Marcus disappears under mysterious circumstances, the tower collapses during your watch, and the equipment shows signs of unauthorized modifications. What really happened up here? I looked at the wreckage of the transmission tower, twisted steel beams that told a story no one would believe. The entities were still trapped in their frequency prison, but their electromagnetic cage had been seriously damaged. The next technician assigned to rebuild this station would face the same supernatural encounters, probably with even less warning than I'd received. Bill, if I told you the truth, you'd have me committed for psychological evaluation. Try me. I pulled David's letter from my jacket pocket and handed it to him. Bill read through the warnings about supernatural entities and frequency manifestations, his skepticism obvious in every facial expression. Sarah, this is elaborate fiction, someone's idea of a practical joke. I thought the same thing until I heard my dead sister's voice calling through the emergency frequencies. Bill studied my face carefully, looking for signs of stress or psychological breakdown. What he saw there must have convinced him that I believed what I was saying, even if he couldn't accept the explanation itself. You've been under tremendous pressure lately. Your mother's medical bills, the job market, isolation up here during a severe storm. Sometimes the mind creates experiences that feel completely real but aren't actually happening. Then explain the frequency changes. Explain why Marcus mentioned voices in his maintenance log. Explain why every technician assigned to this tower for the past 30 years has either disappeared or quit after reporting equipment malfunctions. That last point made Bill pause. He'd been with the company long enough to remember some of the previous incidents, though he'd always attributed them to the difficulty of working in such an isolated location. You're saying there's a pattern? I'm saying this tower is different from our other installations. Something about its location, or its frequency range, or its construction creates conditions that trap electromagnetic entities, and those entities are getting stronger. Bill looked at the letter again, then at the wreckage of the tower, then back at me. Even if I believed you, which I don't, what would you want me to do about it? File a report claiming supernatural activity? Recommend that we abandon a $1 million installation because of ghost stories? Recommend that we permanently decommission this site. Find somewhere else to build the replacement tower. Don't send another technician up here alone. Before Bill could respond, Janet Reese approached with news that changed everything. We found Marcus Webb. She led us to a section of the tower wreckage where the falling steel had gouged deep trenches in the earth. In one of those trenches, partially buried under twisted metal, were human remains that had been there much longer than 3 days. Preliminary examination suggests these bones have been here for months, possibly years. We'll need forensic analysis to determine identity, but the clothing fragments match Marcus's description. I felt sick. Marcus hadn't disappeared 3 days ago. He'd been dead for months. But if that was true, who had been maintaining the tower's equipment logs up until this week? Bill voiced the question I was afraid to ask. If Marcus has been dead for months, who wrote these maintenance entries dated last week? Janet examined the logbook I'd found in the equipment building. The handwriting was consistent throughout, showing no signs of forgery or multiple authors. But the final entries described equipment problems and supernatural encounters that matched my own experiences exactly. This doesn't make sense, Janet said. Either someone else was impersonating Marcus, or... She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what she was thinking. Or Marcus's consciousness had somehow survived death and continued maintaining the equipment through supernatural means. We need to evacuate this site immediately, I said. Whatever's happening here isn't over. As if summoned by my words, every piece of electronic equipment in the area began malfunctioning simultaneously. The investigators' radios burst into static. Bill's tablet screen flickered with impossible colors, and the helicopter's communication system started broadcasting voices in languages none of us recognized. The entities weren't confined to the damaged tower anymore. The electromagnetic disturbance from our modern electronics was giving them new pathways to manifest, new ways to influence the physical world. Everyone get to the helicopter now, Bill shouted over the electronic chaos. We ran through the snow toward the landing zone, but the aircraft's systems were failing rapidly. The pilot was struggling with controls that no longer responded properly, and the engine was making sounds that suggested imminent mechanical failure. I can't get her started, the pilot called out. Something's interfering with the ignition system. I looked back at the tower wreckage and saw them clearly for the first time in daylight. The entities were emerging from the twisted steel like smoke-given form, growing more solid as they fed on the electromagnetic energy from our equipment. The signal thief had taken the shape of Marcus Webb, but wrong in fundamental ways that made him look like a photograph that had been partially erased. The Echo Mother appeared as Katie, my dead sister. but her eyes held intelligence that was ancient and utterly inhuman. Behind them, the tower climbers were reassembling the wreckage through some kind of electromagnetic manipulation, rebuilding their prison into a more sophisticated form that could influence technology across a wider range. They're adapting, I said, learning to use our own equipment against us. Bill was staring at the entities with the expression of someone watching his entire understanding of reality crumble. Those things, they're actually real. They're real, and they're not going to stay trapped much longer. We need to get word to the FCC, the Forest Service, everyone who has authority over communication towers. This site needs to be quarantined permanently. The helicopter's engine finally caught, and we lifted off just as the entities reached the landing zone. Through the aircraft's windows, I watched them standing in the snow, tracking our departure with expressions that suggested they were already planning their next move. During the flight back to civilization, I told the investigators everything. The complete truth about the supernatural encounters, David's warnings, Marcus's real fate, and the growing threat posed by entities that could manipulate electromagnetic frequencies. Some of them believed me, others thought I'd suffered a psychological breakdown. But everyone agreed that the tower site should be permanently abandoned and marked as hazardous to human occupation. 6 months later, I received a call from a technician working on a cellular tower in Montana. He'd found a letter hidden in the equipment housing, written by someone named Sarah Chen, warning about supernatural entities that lived in radio frequencies. The entities were spreading, moving from tower to tower, carrying their electromagnetic prison with them as communication networks expanded across the country. Each installation they infected became a new source of supernatural activity, a new trap for unwary technicians who worked alone in isolated locations. I kept copies of David's warnings and added my own experiences to the documentation. The letter grew longer with each new encounter, each new tower that fell under the entity's influence. But I also discovered something else. The entities weren't entirely malevolent. They were trapped, desperate to escape a form of existence they never chose. Some of them really were the electromagnetic echoes of human consciousness, people who had died near communication towers and become entangled in the frequency spectrum. My sister Katie was among them. The Echo Mother hadn't been lying about her identity. She really was Katie's consciousness, preserved in electromagnetic form, but changed by decades of imprisonment with alien intelligences. When I finally accepted that truth, I began working on a different kind of solution. Instead of just warning people about the entities, I started researching ways to communicate with them safely, methods of establishing dialogue without triggering their predatory responses, techniques for helping trapped human consciousnesses find peace while containing the more dangerous alien intelligences. It's slow work, dangerous work, and most people think I'm insane for attempting it. But every tower that goes dark represents another group of entities breaking free, another threat to the electromagnetic infrastructure that modern civilization depends on. Someone has to find a better solution than just running away and hoping the problem doesn't spread. Someone has to learn how to talk with the static souls. The work continues, one frequency at a time, one tower at a time, one lost consciousness at a time. Because in the end, the entities aren't the real enemy. The real enemy is the isolation that drives people to such desperate measures, the loneliness that makes electromagnetic prison seem preferable to facing the world alone. And sometimes, late at night when I'm monitoring the frequencies, I hear Katie's voice calling through the static, not the Echo Mother's predatory imitation, but my real sister's consciousness, asking me to help her find her way home. I'm still working on that answer.